Good evening, everybody. My name is Peter Matheson, and I'm the principal of the University of Edinburgh. And it's my very great pleasure to be introducing our 5th annual Salvesen Lecture this evening, which is being delivered by Professor Holly Joseph and Dr. Alison Pofu-Coles, both of whom are from the University of Reading. So welcome to them, welcome to you. My thanks to all the organisers for the preparations and the running of this meeting, which I know is being run as a hybrid event and also being recorded for others to listen to in the future. My particular thanks to Alistair Salvesen, whose sponsorship underlies the Salvesen Mind Room activities at the University of Edinburgh, for his unfailing support of the university. And I know you're going to be hearing a message from Alistair himself later on in the proceedings. So to tell you a little bit about the speakers, Holly is a developmental psychologist, and in her lecture she will reveal some of the journey that she has taken in her career from lab-based fundamental discovery science through to implementation with and in communities. In the later work, she's partnered with Alice, who's a community research associate, refugee champion, and a local government councillor. Alice and Holly will be talking about, and I quote, learning to read in the wider context, why understanding families, communities, and social inequalities are key to supporting children's language and literacy. The lecture will focus on the development and delivery of community initiatives aimed at promoting a love of reading in young children and their families. You can look forward to deep insights into the complexities of communities and a powerful example of the role of co-production as an essential prerequisite for successful implementation of new programs. Co-development is also at the heart of the two Salvesen Mind Room Centres who host the lecture. The Charity and Research Centre's collaborative working generates research that builds on real-world issues, addresses community priorities, and delivers impact in practice. We're very grateful to our speakers for recording the lecture so that we can broadcast their work around the globe. We know that each year hundreds of people watch the Salvesen Lecture during the broadcast, and thousands more will be viewing the recording later. So we know this will be an excellent contribution to our growing archive of public talks. So with that, that's enough for me. I'll hand over to Holly and Alice for this year's Salvesen Lecture on learning to read in the wider context. Thank you very much for joining.
Hello and welcome. I'm delighted to be talking to you today for the Salvesen Annual Lecture, and I'll be talking about learning to read, focusing on why we need to think about the wider context that surrounds a child in order to best support them. So today's talk has, I guess, 3 main parts and 2 speakers. So first of all, I'll take you kind of on a journey, if you like, of the way that I used to do research, and indeed how most people used to do and still do research in the area of reading difficulties, and talk about the limitations of this approach. Then I'll talk a little bit about, the way that reading research could be if we broaden our view of what neurodiversity means, if we recognise and identify systemic barriers, and if we take a different kind of community-led approach. I'll then pass over to Dr. Alison Pofu-Coles, who's an expert in participatory research and community-based research, and she will explain more about that approach and give some great examples of research using this kind of approach. And then Alice will pass back to me briefly just to give some kind of examples and stories from reading research that uses this kind of approach. Okay, so let me take you back to about 2003, 2004, when I had just started my PhD at the University of Durham. And my PhD compared the eye movements of children and adults as they read using an eye tracker. And I collected all the data, I think, as far as I remember anyway, in a lab at the university. So I had very little or no contact with schools. And I guess the assumptions underlying this research was that children were all the same as each other, and they're really only of interest in terms of how much they differ from adults, who, by the way, are also all the same as each other, and they're all undergraduate psychology students. And you can see on the left here a graph from my first ever paper, I think, which is looking at where children versus adults look in words of different lengths. And you probably don't need me to tell you that they don't differ very much. So what was the problem with this approach? It was a very common approach. I guess there were kind of two things. Who were the children that I did test? Those were children who were brought to the university by their parents as a kind of fun afternoon out after school or at the weekend. The children that we tested were almost exclusively extremely good readers. Almost all the parents were university educated. In fact, many of them were academics, and almost all the children were white, and almost all the children were monolingual. And so sort of if we sort of look on the other side of the coin, who were the children that I didn't test? Well, I mean, I actively, and as I say, it wasn't just me, but I actively excluded children who didn't fit a very, very strict set of inclusion criteria. So if children spoke more than one language, so that's about 20% of school-age children now, a bit less back then, just they weren't invited to take part in the study. If children had a diagnosed special educational need, they were also excluded. So I was already sort of looking at children without reading difficulties, which was what I was interested in, but you know, that in itself is questionable. And of course, I only tested children who had parents who were resourced enough and able to spare time to take their children to university. So I had a very, very unrepresentative sample, both of the children and the adults that I was referring to. And this group of participants are sometimes referred to as weird. So weird stands for Western educated, industrialised, rich and democratic, and that certainly was the case for both my adult and my child participants. So I finished my PhD and I moved to a postdoctoral fellowship, and I looked at children with and without reading difficulties, with and without comprehension difficulties specifically, still tracking their eye movements. So at least at this stage I was acknowledging that not all children are the same, and it's worthwhile understanding how they differ. But I was following, again, the norm at the time, which was to categorise children into typical, read good, and atypical, read bad, groups, ignoring the huge variability both within groups and also assuming a meaningful categorical difference between groups. And of course, I was also the person who decided which group they were in. So it didn't matter what a child or their parent thought, I decided if they were in the typical or the atypical group. And although this all may sound, I promise you it was the norm at the time. So based on the simple view of reading, which you can see here, which I still see as a very useful framework for researchers and practitioners, reading is the product of two components, decoding and linguistic comprehension, with both of these components necessary and neither sufficient on its own. And this framework has given us a way, I suppose, to understand reading difficulties within 4 quadrants. We love a quadrant in psychology. So you can see here children with decoding difficulties, but no problem with linguistic comprehension, have a dyslexic type profile. Children who have no problems with decoding or linguistic comprehension make up the majority of children and often called typical readers. Children who have difficulties with both decoding and linguistic comprehension are called general poor readers or something like that. And then the group of children that I was interested in during my postdoc were poor comprehenders. So their decoding was fine, but their linguistic comprehension was less good. And researchers are always interested in the sort of top left and bottom right quadrants because they are theoretically interesting, but obviously in terms of, you know, societal need and ethics, that is arguably quite problematic. And of course, the other problem is that very few children fit neatly into one of these 4 boxes. So this is sort of closer to the reality. And so categorizing children in this way gives us an exaggerated view of how different the groups are from one another, and also how similar children within one of those 4 groups are to each other. So I guess what this slide shows is kind of the way that I used to think and how I think now. So back then in 2004-ish, and you know, I'm not going to pretend that I stopped thinking this in 2004 either. It's continued for some time. The approach was very much about forming homogenous groups of children. So that might just be children, or it might be sort of subgroups of children, so poor comprehenders and typically developing children, all these awful labels. Children who didn't meet strict inclusion criteria were excluded, and this was very important because we wanted to exclude sources of variance that we weren't interested in, and so for that reason we would exclude multilingual children with identified special educational need, and sometimes children with other difficulties which weren't directly related to reading but we thought might affect their reading. So we had a very unrepresentative sample of readers, whether we were looking at typical or atypically developing children. And then sort of related to that, we always had this benchmark of typically developing children, and if we had children who had reading difficulties, they were always compared to this benchmark. So it's kind of quite a deficit kind of approach to this kind of research. And then I guess finally where I think we were not doing things quite right was we were taking diagnostic label as a kind of really good indicator of the strengths and or difficulties of a child. So if a child had a label of dyslexia, that was kind of good enough for us to assume that they had reading difficulties, and a child who didn't have that label, we would assume that their reading was typical. So now I feel very differently. I don't want to form homogenous groups of children because I know that those groups aren't representative. So embrace diversity, expect heterogeneity, because that's the reality of human beings, including children in classrooms. And one way to do this is to go into schools and test every child in the class, if that's ethically possible. Don't exclude children on the basis of their language or their reading ability, both for ethical reasons but also for validity reasons, because we want research to make sense not to a small extreme group of children but to all children. And then finally rejecting the idea of typical and atypical as meaningful or useful categories and replace it with a kind of more a view of neurodiversity as a continuum, and as I'll talk about in a moment, not just in terms of diagnostic label or even sort of difficulties that you might be able to find through assessment, but actually taking a much broader view than that. So what does this mean in terms of how reading research could be? What needs to change and how can we do things differently? Well, there are kind of three main ways in which I'm now doing research differently. One is around neurodiversity and kind of broadening how I conceptualize neurodiversity. One is around identifying systemic barriers to reading and the experience that children have at school. And I'm going to talk about two of those, poverty and language. And then the third one is in how we actually do the research. And that relates to co-production of research and participatory community-based research. And Alice will be talking about that. So I've touched upon this already, and I know many people watching this will agree that we should move away from thinking about neurodiversity as closely linked to diagnostic status. We know that many people who identify as neurodivergent don't have a diagnosis, and equally there are many children and young people who neither have a diagnosis nor identify as neurodivergent, who face challenges and deserve support. So this is a general point about neurodiversity and diagnostic status, but I think it's probably particularly true when we're talking about literacy. And this is primarily because getting a diagnosis of reading difficulty, particularly dyslexia, is highly associated with economic background. So let's have a look at who is likely to get a dyslexia diagnosis. I mean, the first thing to say is that a private assessment costs around £600, maybe a bit more. And while in theory you shouldn't have to pay for an assessment, in reality, waiting lists for an educational psychologist or a trained specialist to do an assessment for free in school are extremely long. And schools often recommend that parents pay for a private assessment if they can. And even if they can't, schools have very limited budgets and access to trained assessors, and so they have to make really difficult decisions when deciding what to prioritise. And often a child who's struggling to learn to read will not be the top of their list. So parents who can pay tend to pay. And recent research shows that the three strongest predictors of receiving a dyslexia diagnosis by the age of 11 are high socioeconomic class, high family income, and the child attending a fee-paying school. So in some ways, if your child is struggling to learn to read, having a dyslexia or other reading difficulty diagnosis is a privilege. And the converse of that is who doesn't get a diagnosis. Well, essentially, it's children of parents who can't pay, perhaps don't want to pay, or perhaps don't even know that this is an option. And these children tend to be poorer and more marginalised, and their parents tend to be less well-resourced and less able to seek support. And the children are also more likely to have parents or other family members who do have literacy difficulties, but without a diagnosis. So the issue becomes intergenerational. I think it's fair to say that these children and their families are not well represented in the research literature, and their voices are seldom heard. And that's true within the neurodiversity movement, as it is in society more generally. So I think we need to go beyond diagnosis, but we also need to go beyond self-identification to include children and young people who don't even think of themselves as being dyslexic or having a reading difficulty, because this hasn't been suggested to them, or maybe hasn't even occurred to them as a way to think about how they experience learning to read. And so it's really essential that we throw the net wide to include families and communities who may not even be aware of the neurodiversity community, and certainly not think of themselves as part of that community. And I hope that taking this wider view will help us to gain more insights into the experience of more children and young people who struggle with reading, and therefore make us better as a society and as a research community to support them. And that brings us to the transdiagnostic revolution, which is a revolution, I guess, happening within the research literature, but also more broadly, which argues that diagnostic labels are of limited value in terms of what they can tell us. So first of all, not everyone with a particular diagnostic label is, of course, the same. And yeah, the sort of now famous saying of, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. And previous research designs, such as the ones I was describing earlier, have really exaggerated the homogeneity of groups of children and how separate they are in terms of their diagnostic label. And the graph you can see on the left here is from a paper by Duncan Astle and colleagues. And what they did was take lots and lots and lots of children and measure their educational attainment, their cognitive and learning abilities, and also looked at their patterns of brain organisation. And they also got information about if they had a diagnosis of ADHD, autism, dyslexia, and other neurodevelopmental conditions. And basically what this graph is showing, is representing, is that diagnostic status or label tells you very little about these other measures that they took. So it doesn't predict educational attainment, it doesn't predict cognitive and learning abilities, and it doesn't predict patterns of brain organisation. So what does this mean in terms of literacy, reading difficulties? Well, one thing it clearly suggests is that the support that we give to a child who's struggling with their reading or anything else should not rely on the diagnosis a child already has. And schools already work on this principle. They don't need a diagnostic label in order to offer a child additional support. But in reality, a diagnostic label can bring with it more immediate or targeted support. It can be easier to argue for that support if you have a diagnostic label. And The division between diagnosis and support is particularly important for literacy, given that diagnostic status is associated with parental income. So some children, based on their socioeconomic background, are more likely to have a diagnosis than others, irrespective of their experience and their abilities in learning to read. So many children with literacy difficulties, particularly those from poorer backgrounds, will not have been identified, and if they are identified, they're likely to be identified later. And so it's really important that intervention is not based on diagnosis. And therefore, it makes sense that whole class, whole school, or whole community initiatives are a really good way forward, because they're likely to benefit many children, including unidentified children, and harm nobody. The whole idea of good SEND teaching is good teaching for everyone. Okay, so let's move now to systemic barriers to learning to read. We can look at government data, such as the National Pupil Database, and over many years we've seen some very well established and very strong predictors of poor educational attainment, including poor literacy. And I'm sure you already know what these are. So these relate to socioeconomic status. So this is often measured using either postcode data and indices of multiple deprivation associated with that postcode, or eligibility for free school meals. Ethnicity is predictive of educational attainment. Having identified a special educational need, being care experienced, or known to be a child in need or at risk, and also things like parental income and parental education, which are not routinely recorded in government data sets such as the National Pupil Database. So we sort of know all of these risk factors, but I guess the question is, how does this help us? How does this help us to provide good support for children from a wide range of backgrounds, so that more children can develop good literacy skills that will help them in society? I guess knowing these barriers, I don't deny these are barriers, but knowing these barriers is probably not enough to help these children, and also has the danger that comes with it of deficit thinking. So finding out somebody's postcode or that they're care experienced, and perhaps a bit too quickly or unconsciously even lowering your expectation of that child's future educational attainment. And so perhaps more helpful than just knowing what these sort of predictors of low attainment are is trying to unpack them, trying to understand them and the impact they might have on children from families in whatever category it is. So thinking about poverty, first of all, there is, I think, a really negative narrative or blame culture around poverty and literacy and language. And we see this in the research literature, but also, you know, in schools and in society more generally, where we tend to blame the mother and see her child's difficulties as a direct consequence of her failings. So sort of narratives around, you know, mothers should, but in these cases don't, read to their or read to her children, go to the library, provide a rich home language environment, model a love of reading. And the kind of assumption is that if she would just, you know, bother doing this, everything would be fine. But of course, that is a gross simplification of the reality of, you know, parenthood and all the complexities that brings, particularly if you are living in circumstances that are very difficult for you to financially provide for your family. And here is one example of that. So this is an abstract from a paper that I have anonymised. And you can see in the parts that I've highlighted, the paper is about showing that poverty or low SES has a negative effect on language skills. And so it says children from low SES families are more likely to experience limited language and cognitive stimulation from their home environment. These children have smaller vocabulary sizes, less sophisticated knowledge than normative population. So what's that saying? That these children are not normal. The results suggest that language intervention should be initiated in order to improve reading comprehension for children in poverty. So I say to the authors of that paper, how about improving the poverty? Surely this is the wrong way to look at it. If poverty is imposed upon people in society, surely that is the problem, rather than telling those people that there's something wrong with them and they need to work harder to improve it. And the other systemic barrier I want to talk about today, and of course there are many others, is around language and linguistic racism. So I think you'll probably agree that there's a kind of hierarchy of languages in this country, with English at the top and European languages next. And if you look at which languages, for example, are taught at secondary school, which might be a reflection of the languages that we sort of rate highly, you'll see that they are European languages. So French, Spanish, German, and then all of the other languages taught are a tiny proportion compared to those main three. And those do not reflect the languages that are most commonly spoken in this country. So here you can see the most commonly spoken languages in England, other than English, of course, which are Polish, Romanian, Punjabi and Urdu. So I think this tells us something about the value we place on different languages, and the fact that non-European languages are very much less valued, and how this intersects with racism, right? Because non-European languages are more likely to be spoken by black and brown people. And I think what this sometimes means in schools and in societies is that multilingual children, who are often at least in England, referred to as EAL children. English is an additional language, so English again has the priority in describing these children who are multilingual. EAL children are often seen in terms of deficit, so what they can't do, while to some extent ignoring the wealth of linguistic knowledge they have across their 2 or 3 or more languages. And this linguistic racism, or these systemic barriers related to language, can relate to English only too. So recently there have been reports of some schools banning certain words or expressions. So expressions such as bear, that's long, oh my days. And these are expressions that are disproportionately used by people of colour. And so in this sense, this is a form of linguistic racism in which different Englishes, so Englishes such as Black British English or multicultural London English, are perceived as inferior to so-called standard English. So this is around language and power and racism. So I guess the last few slides, the point I'm trying to make is that multilingual children and children of colour, and obviously often those there are many children who fall into both of those categories. Both of those groups are more likely to have their language categorised as incorrect or inferior. So taken together, what this means is, firstly, that because of societal barriers and injustices, certain children are much less likely to have a reading difficulty identified, and this is compounded by sometimes compounded by low expectations of these same children, because there is a narrative that says that low income is associated with poor parenting and poor educational attainment, and so poor reading is expected. But secondly, that children from certain backgrounds relating to language and race or ethnicity are more likely to be incorrectly identified as having a language or literacy difficulty, because their difference in how they speak or use language is pathologized. So we've got kind of two sides two problems which have the same source, which is societal injustice. So we've established that children without diagnoses of reading difficulties, children from lower income homes, multilingual children and children of colour all face additional systemic barriers and are less likely to be part of this conversation about what is needed in society and are less likely to be represented in research. And these so-called hard to reach communities, hate that term, because essentially what that means is marginalised communities who aren't listened to. They need to be involved and they need to be listened to. And this can't happen quickly. It takes time to build trust. People in communities whose trust has been broken or who have not felt heard need time to develop relationships, develop that trust. But if we invest in that over time, we can work with families and communities so that children whose needs may be under-recognised or certainly not met may have the opportunity to thrive. And that is what co-production of research and participatory research aims to do. So I'm going to hand you over now to Dr. Alison Mpofu-Coles, who's going to talk to you more about participatory research.
Thank you, Professor Holly Joseph. My name is Dr. Salvesen Lecture. I'm a human geographer. I would like to talk more about participatory action research and community research, giving examples of the work we have been doing with communities using this methodology. So what is participatory action research, which is sometimes called PAR? Mark Taggart brings in the 16 tenets of PAR, which I'll probably approach it in a way that he has done. It is an approach to improve social practice by changing it. It is a contingence on authentic participation. It is collaborative. It establishes self-critical communities. It is a systematic learning process, involves people in theorizing about their practices, requires that people put their practices, ideas and assumptions about institute to the test. It involves keeping records, requires participants to objectify their own experience. It is also a political process because it involves many critical analyses. It starts small, it takes time, it starts with small circles, it starts with small groups, allows and requires participants to build records, allows and requires participants to give a reasonable justification of their social educational work to others. On another note, Payne states that the key is involving the participant at all stages and making sure their voices are heard in dissemination and action. So how does PAR work with communities? PAR's main components of this scholarly work is outside the university, and it collaborates and brings those that are marginalized in our society to think together for social change. We always have to bear in mind that communities have the knowledge and know what they need. It shifts the power imbalance that are typically associated with knowledge to look at poverty, health and well-being, and lack of support that are stereotyped, as Holly mentioned, hard to reach. To understand we have to understand their language by language. I mean how they communicate or relate to things. As someone who uses feminist approaches to research, it is important to work with communities about the methods that they work for them, bearing in mind, as I mentioned, that sometimes it might not be verbalized words. It can be diagrams, diaries, photos, poems, music lyrics, visual, blogs, etc. I'll now give you some example of participatory works that we have done. In 2019, we did an aging well research with undergraduates coming out into the communities which are with us as a learning curve in the geography department. It was commissioned by the local authority for the Department of Geography to carry out this strategy of aging well for Black, Asian, minority ethnicity and refugees in the area. they had found it very difficult for them to gain access to these communities. So they commissioned this research through the university. So the main thing when it comes to PA is to gain trust by coming in to the community, not with a notebook and a clipboard to exhume a lot of things from them, but coming in to know that they have the knowledge. It was humbling ourselves in those spaces of the community, participating in their social and cultural capital, gaining their trust, building on the philosophy of Ubuntu, I am because you are. For example, the Nepalese community like doing yoga and walking in the parks early in the morning or in the evening. In the Windrush generation, some of them attend church and lunch clubs. So it was about going into these different spaces of the communities, being with them, and then the communities felt they could share their lived experience and the barriers of why they were having difficulties to have services delivered to them. So they are the ones that are the experts in knowing what is happening in their communities. Another research, participatory action research we did in the community was the Oxford Road Part 1, which was funded by the Historic England through the local authority High Street Heritage Action Zone in 2020 to 2022. Oxford Road is one of the most diverse places in Reading, with over 72 languages spoken and also pockets of deprivation. I call it the United Nations as it has so many restaurants from all over the world and the different languages you hear in that street when you walk around. There are also Georgian and Victorian brick-built terraced house contributing to the Oxford Road's distinctive urban historic character. There's an Oxford Road in most towns and cities. And to get into these communities, we spent a lot of time working, me and PhD researcher students, Robin and Toby, an undergraduate architect student. Most of our work that we do with participatory action research, we do work with undergraduates also, and also PhD students, so that they can know how to relate to communities that are marginalized in our community, in our society. As it was during the COVID pandemic of distancing, we first did the participatory engagement. Participatory engagement is just as good as participatory observation, because we're walking around the streets, attending social groups, talking to people in cafes or in the streets, not particularly about our research, but trying to find out the dynamics of the people of Oxford Road. As you can see, there's the word Ankwabe on this slide, means in Ghanaian for welcome. So we sat in barber shops where Ghanaians have got barber shops, hair products and different things, and just understood the different communities in Oxford Road. The participants who wanted to engage with this piece of research chose the dissemination and action. They wanted a mural on the road and interviewed the artist who was going to produce the mural. They shared their history, which is now at the museum. The young group Untold, which had 4 young ladies who grew up on Oxford Road. Some of them grew up in Reading, and did a documentary after having participated on Oxford Road about refugees and homelessness on the road. Our ethics has to be redone, and it became clear that there was some issues concerning discrimination. So we wrote our ethics again and put on a clause to say there was zero tolerance of racism or discrimination, as I found it challenging to interview participants who had different persuasions of people from Black and Asian backgrounds. Through the first successful research project for Oxford Road, the Historic England further funded it. The Life Spring Story is a place on Oxford Road which was used as the old pavilion for cinema and social events, and it is now a church called Life Spring. It is central to the community of Oxford Road. They are based in the heart of Oxford Road and they work on a non-denominational angle, and it helps a lot of homeless, substance misuse, people just in general to come into the area, into their community hall and have social events, come and eat. The food is much cheaper there. There are different community groups that come into the space. We spent 1 month knowing the communities, me and my colleague Robin, eating with them and understanding their identity and their dynamics without asking again any questions related to our research. By so doing, we were mapping out and scoping how we would plan the second research on Life Spring Stories. There are people who have struggled with substance misuse, domestic abuse, refugees living in hotels on the Oxford Road, and some of them benefit a lot by coming to Life Spring Center. The refugees come there because they're learning English. And then there is also the Tokla group, which included, as you can see on the photo, the lady who is on the right, that she was there looking after children as a childminder. She has been a childminder for a long time, but looking at after children with very diverse needs. And we also had to interview her. What we found was that there was the commonality of wanting to share their stories for people to hear what happens on Oxford Road, as it is a marginalized area, and some people think it is gentrified. So they wanted to share their photos, some not the face, some wanted their hands and feet, and some wanted their tattoos that actually identify who they are. We worked with Baker Street Production, who recorded and ascribed most of the stories. In PAR, you have to be mindful of the traumas participants bring to their stories and be compassionate, caring, and safeguard the participants and team. Refugees had traumatic experiences and they were now living in hotels for the past 2 years, and they had gone through, some of them, rape, children struggling and living in fear in hotels. We would then, when we were doing the recording, be aware of these traumas that they've gone through, and we'll stop recording, regroup and moderate those emotions with them, to ask them how they were feeling, showing caring, finding a drink or taking a break and having some food with them. This is a current research. The British Science Association, BSA, in partnership with the University of Reading, embarked on an exciting community-led research pilot using participatory research building on the PAR work, which had been taking place at the university, led by Dr. Sally Lloyd-Evans, which puts communities in the driving seat to develop, lead, and deliver the research pilot ideas. The pilot research started last year in September 2022. It is supported also in collaboration with 2 voluntary community partners who are in Reading and Slough, who then, in their own autonomy, employed local community researchers working with some of our early career researchers who want to explore this kind of work with communities that are new or traditional underrepresented in research. The key about this research is about looking at those communities or groups that are not traditionally represented in research and they are traditionally underrepresenting. Employing community researchers brings the local content of understanding the dynamics, culture, economy, and sometimes the languages communities speak. So, for example, in Slough, there's different languages that are spoken there, and the community researchers can relate to some of these languages and they must also be aware of positionality when they are doing the research. Training was given to community researchers also to understand what is PAR in that, and we worked with an organization called COBRA. One of the key things is trust. So all the 13 groups that we have worked with have been funded for activity testing, and now have been able to we are now able to fund 6 groups to work with academics as an expertise basis, looking at how the communities themselves are experts and how they can bring some experts working with other researchers at the university. So we started with 13 groups that did activity testing, and then we moved from there when they did their activity testing what they wanted to do, and then we asked them to write reports, and then we now currently fund 6 groups ongoing until 2024. The projects that we are funding include ecosystems, recycling, gardening, identity and black hair, sound and mental health, and this will continue until 2024. As I have mentioned before, all this work which is being done is led by the communities. It's more led by the communities. So we put the community groups in the forefront of everything. So when the researchers come in there, they are also led by the communities who know the things that are quite important to them. I'll bring another key component of PAR, which is how to disseminate the data or information on my next slide. The decolonial approach in PAR is important that communities participate in how they disseminate their information. Traditional ways of writing journals, books are still important, but the majority of the communities, we have to be aware that we research, have no access to these journals. By not having access to journals, it means they are left out on how they can advocate about things that are important to them. So by doing a decolonial approach about this, it is advocating for knowledge production processings that are different. It reaches different communities who might not have engaged with what we call research. Nonkolo states that theories and concepts that might have been extracted from those that are marginalized in our society, poorer and disabled with neurodiversity, those who struggle with reading, end up brutally exploited, their voices diluted, and then completely forgotten when it comes to dissemination of their work. As you can see on the picture, we have also done with the Oxford Road project. It followed the 16 tenets of PAR and disseminated the research according to what the participants wanted. So we had the mural, as I mentioned before, and then the photos. They are all over the community areas, in particular in Oxford Road. We have recipe cards that were produced by different participants with their, what they call their mother's recipe, which are all over the shops in Oxford Road again, so people can pick up a recipe card, buy the ingredients inside the shops, and go and cook something at home. The photo stories are in libraries in Reading and in places like the local community areas. And it's also now at the Reading Museum for Legacy and History at the museum. We widened this dissemination by producing stories as people wanted, the participants in particular wanted people to hear their stories about substance misuse, refugees, that are very topical issues, and domestic abuse. So we put, with the help of participants, on Spotify, so that even the younger generation or anybody who like to listen, they just don't have to go in to pull out a book in the library. They can listen to it on Spotify, Apple Music, and the participant had the opportunity to speak for the first time on BBC radio, talking about the research and how they have been consulted through from the first stage to actually dissemination to this day. Also, I'll just give you a perspective of how I used also participatory action research for my PhD research, which was about the identity of young immigrants born in Zimbabwe, intergenerational issues. I did participatory observation. Going to nightclubs is quite important to associate with young people in their own spaces, festivals, social events, churches, camping. For their identity, they use diagrams, as you can see on the slide, suggested by them, young people. Some wrote music lyrics about how they identify themselves. They use photos, they use blogs, they use the Instagram to talk about their identities. They requested me to come to forums where they will discuss on YouTube about their identities. The narratives were put in the thesis, and long as they were, and they were said in so many ways that the young people's language was actually mentioned throughout the thesis. The young people's 21st century was very much present in what action they needed to be done by educational institutions, demanding racial equality, home office visas, university spaces to be able to influence policy making into their complex life of immigration as 1.5 generation, which is children born in their country who come as refugees or working visa with their parents when they are in primary school or early teens. PA itself has got its own challenges. It can arise, as I mentioned, to ethics, as mentioned in the beginning, and you have to revisit everyone to find out if they agree with how they want to disseminate the research, or working with different frameworks with organizations can also be challenging, as each organization has its framework. Working with taking photos sometimes with children you have to be very careful on how you do that, and making sure that all the ethics have gone through. As you can see on the slide, it takes time, and also ethical issues are very much considered. Translators were the key to a successful research with diverse languages. So we brought in diverse translators from actually students at our university, international students who could speak different languages. Food brings people together, and bearing in mind we work with poorer and marginalized societies. If you bring food when you are doing the research, people do appreciate. Working with people with different neurodiversity needs consideration about time and how they get to the places, about their needs and confidentiality, and how you also disclose to the team if there is one of the participants or one of the team members that has got neurodiversity. The external production team on the Oxford Road, we had a reflection time every morning before we started about what we had done yesterday and what we can do better with how we did yesterday. The daily encounters also took into context our positionality. The team consisted of Black African, white mixed race, white male, and a Polish lady. One of the things when you're working with participatory research is be aware of as an insider in these communities, e.g. if you are from the refugee communities, you've got a disability, your gender, cultural, and other things. So you have to consider your positionality. So there's a lot of gender inequalities in some cultures. There's also some substance misuse. So you have to be non-judgmental, or ethnicity can also cause communities to either want to talk to you or refuse, as they think you might disclose within their communities about what they talk to you about. So build that trust in the beginning when you're starting to do the participatory engagement. Also, the work involves working unorthodox hours, sometimes at weekends, as communities, some of them volunteer in community groups and they are not available during working hours. Also, to remember that the research should be led by the communities who have the knowledge about their needs. It takes time, but when it is put together, participatory action research with communities is fulfilling, and also communities get to do most of the things and make changes that they want in their society. Thank you, and we have some resources at the University of Reading as we have created a part 2 kit. Thank you very much for listening.
So a lot of the work that we've been doing over the past few years, and most of this work is with my colleague Daisy Powell, also at Reading, has been in a place called Whitley in South Reading. And if you Google Whitley, you'll see a map like this and statistics like this, how it's very deprived and lots of children living in poverty and not achieving expected level at different levels of education. There's lots of people out of work, and it's one of these places that's often targeted for funding because it is, known as disadvantaged, deprived, whatever these sort of negative words you want to use. But what these statistics don't tell you is what a wonderful place Whitley is, full of community, incredible people working at community hubs, community centres, in the schools, including Alice, who is a counsellor in Whitley, to really build a sense of community and make it a place that people are proud to live in, love to live in, and a place where they can, take opportunities and live their lives the way that they want to. And on Alice's advice, along with the advice of some other wonderful people working with Alice, before we did anything, we had all these ideas around early literacy, but before we did anything, we went into Whitley, we had coffee with people, we talked to people, we built things up very slowly, and eventually people started talking to us, and we started asking them about their community, what was good about it, what they would like to change, if anything. And they told us a few things very, very clearly. And probably one of the biggest ones, that they were really tired of do-gooders like us coming into their community and telling them, what was good for them. And they would say, we spoke to a lot of parents, and they said, these people don't know our children, we know our children. Why do people think they can just come in here and tell us what's good for our children? They felt that they were being judged. They very, very strongly, most of the people we spoke to disliked this term disadvantaged. They didn't see themselves as disadvantaged. They liked their lives. They found their lives full and interesting, like, many people do. And they really resented this term. And when we talked about the kinds of initiatives we had in mind, they told us very clearly about what might work and what definitely wouldn't work. And one of the really important things was to make sure that what we had planned were these things were taking place in locations where people felt comfortable, and those places often were not schools, because many people had not had a good experience of school, and school was not somewhere they wanted to go back to of their kind of own volition. So I don't have time to tell you in any detail at all about the kinds of initiatives we've been involved in, but here's a kind of overview of what we've done. So we had a parent-run book group it all turned out to be all mums who met monthly at one of the community centres in Whitley, and we provided books for the book members to keep, so after they'd read the book they could sort of keep it at home. And we had really great feedback, and you'll hear a little bit about somebody from that book group around getting back into reading, but also much broader things around better sleep, mental health. We started off with storybook reading sessions for parents and toddlers, and these have been really successful and are still continuing. Again, we bought the books so that families could take them home and sort of build up a sort of mini library. We had coffee and cake, which I think was quite a draw. And as you'll hear from the librarian who helped to run these sessions, it was about a lot more than literacy, about a lot more than storybook reading. It was about getting together, building a community, building structure into the routine of a parent of young children, which the days can feel very long. We organised summer school for children who were starting school the following September. That was not as successful as we'd hoped, and so we're hoping to talk to people more, find out what went wrong and make it better. And we've done, not just in Whitley but elsewhere, we've been running these multilingual storytime activities all over Reading, and the idea really is just to celebrate home languages and for children who are multilingual, but also for monolingual children, to see that there are many languages, all languages are great, and to celebrate multilingualism. And rather than hearing from me about the kind of work we've been doing, I thought it would be nice to hear from three people in Whitley who were involved in various research projects we did. So first is Ellie. Ellie is a local parent who lives in Whitley but didn't grow up in Whitley. We got to know her because she attended some storybook reading sessions and then our summer school, and she's now a community researcher on a current project we're doing, and she talks about what it's like living in Whitley and people's perceptions of Whitley. Next we have Matt. Matt is the librarian at Whitley Library. Matt is amazing, and he helped to set up the storybook reading sessions initially, and now he runs them independently and they're still going strong, which is fantastic. And finally we'll hear from Amy. Amy's a local parent. She attended the storybook sessions with her youngest daughter and also volunteered to run the parent book group, so she'll be talking about that and talking about her story more generally.
Like I was saying, people who've lived here all their lives, like it feels quite insulting to sort of be a concept in other people's minds. It's like the poor and whatever that means. And I think sort of for me as someone who's got to know people here, like you realise each person's life is kind of a complex mix of circumstances and that they're whole people and they're interesting people and they've got lots to teach me, and it's much more of a mutual an opportunity for mutual growth and mutual understanding, like as someone who hasn't grown up here, but equally it's kind of you're like living alongside each other doing life. So I think I guess I think it's important to see that there's more going on in people than kind of, I guess, statistics suggest.
It's the social aspect of it, I think, that is really important as well. It's a chance for people to come together. You know, we've had people coming to the sessions that have never been into the library before, and it's really important. Really important. It makes it really does. There are days where I've gone home and you realise that you've made a real difference.
So let's now hear from Amy. Amy's a local mum with two daughters who had previously faced some challenges and hadn't read for many years at the time that she first came to one of our storybook reading sessions. So let's hear from Amy now.
So we'll rewind a little bit. 6 years ago, I'm in recovery. So I had involvement with social services when I had my second baby, just to make sure that the recovery was going to be sustained. And they were in our lives for the first couple of years, making sure, we were going to sort of groups and everything was, going smoothly, which it was.
So she joined the storybook reading sessions, and then she very kindly, after a little bit of persuasion, kindly volunteered to lead the parent book group with 6 other mums. So I asked her about that, and if it was, you know, a kind of scary thing to do. And here's what she said.
It wasn't hard work, really. It was a chance to meet up, have a coffee, have a slice of cake, and discuss what we'd been reading, but also a chance to chat to each other about sort of personal things as well. Or, you know, there were some books that created quite a lot of emotion in some people if it related quite closely to something they've been through. So then it was a chance to, you know, offload and share about that. For me personally, I found that that's where the mental health aspect comes into it, because I kind of bottle things up quite a lot. And then if you're talking about something that's not exactly directly related to you, but it's something that you can relate to, you're sharing it, but not sharing it personally, but you're still talking about it. So.
And Amy also talked about how reading has now become part of her family routine, what her and her daughters do. And so here she says, also the children seeing us read at home. When we come back from school, we have half an hour of reading time. It's just something that's now etched into what we do. And then she says, I think I'm reading 2 to 3 books a month now. So reading is very much something that she does and that they do as a family. And just to kind of update you on what Amy's doing now, she, after the book group, she went back to college to resit her GCSE maths, and she passed it. And she's now at college studying counselling and social work. So that's a really fantastic development for her in her life. And she talks here about how going to the book club was really beneficial for that. So she says, if I hadn't picked up books since I was 15 and gone back into education, it would have been quite a shock. But now it's just something I enjoy doing. So reading was already part of her life, and so going back to college wasn't as big as an adjustment. So this slide just shows you some current projects we have going on at the moment, 2 of them building very directly from work that you've already heard about. The first one is about adapting the storybook sessions that we ran successfully in a different area called Whitley Wood, where we did try to implement them as part of our first project, but unsuccessfully. So we're trying to find out about why that didn't work and what's needed to make those work, if they can work. The middle project is with Alice and Naomi Flynn, another colleague, and this is working in the Oxford Road area where Alice has already worked to try to co-produce locally driven heritage language events, depending on what people in that community want and what can work. And the final one's a little bit different. It's led by Kathy Manning, and it's about identifying community priorities for dyslexia research. So very simply just asking people with dyslexia and parents of children with dyslexia what they think should be researched, to take that on board when designing future projects. But what about my boxes? What about my lovely, neat, homogeneous groups and my exclusion criteria and my experimental methods and my causal relationships? Well, I think there is a place for experimental research. I think it would be kind of crazy to say that there isn't, but I guess now I really am committed to informing any experimental research that I do with more participatory, more inclusive approaches, so that we are capturing the voices and the opinions and the needs of a much broader range of people. And my approach at the moment is to combine these small scale participatory projects, which are really important, but combine them with these very large scale projects where I use secondary data analysis to look at big government data sets, which are also very inclusive in a different kind of way. And yeah, my colleague Vishnu Nair calls me and others recovering positivists. And I love this label, and I very much identify with that label. And as a recovering positivist, I think my mantra to myself after many, many years of thinking that causal relationships are everything is to tell myself that actually there's more to life than causal relationships. They have their place, but they should be embedded in a broader context that encompasses more people and more perspectives. And it just remains to say now, thank you. Thank you to the funders that funded this research. Thank you to everybody on this slide that took part or contributed to this research, and to everybody that I couldn't fit on this slide. And thank you, of course, to you for listening. Thank you. And here you can just see some resources that Alice shared, particularly have a look at the first one, which is the PAR toolkit. If you're interested in doing some participatory research, this is a really great place to look. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends, thank you first of all very much for attending the Salvesen Lecture 23. And thank you, Holly and Alice, so much for actually the hard work that you've done over the years to actually be chosen by Sue to undertake this lecture. I think it is so important that when you're doing research like this, that you actually do understand the families, communities, and social inequalities that are involved in the subject we're discussing, which is neurodiversity. Children's language and literally is absolutely key. And I think this is so important, and why more and more should be done to encourage reading, because there's far too few people who know how to read or spell in today's world. I think the linkage that you've found out that we are far too apt to be looking at the English language and also European languages when we're comparing people who have neurodiversity, whereas the other languages used throughout the world are not only being used throughout the Western world, but all over the world. And we're trying to solve the problems of neurodiversity worldwide. I also very much agree with your comment that diagnostic labels are sometimes dangerous. I think they are a very poor predictor of educational achievement, because some people find it impossible to do the reading, or for that matter, the understanding. And sometimes it's purely a simple matter of whether they are using a computer and they have a different background color on that computer or what it may be. So why and how people succeed in doing the decoding into linguistic comprehension is something we have got to understand more fully. I also agree fully that the diagnosis has been used far too often to define what support people should receive in schooling and other places. Whereas it is a matter of everyone has to learn how to read. And the diagnosis, as said before, often are wrong. And therefore, and those that are allowed to be diagnosed is often those who are the most well off in the community, as opposed to the poorest. And everyone must be considered. So although the idea initially undertaken by Holly, I think was absolutely right, to actually try and find common angles and then perhaps change one thing after another in the diagnosis and the research. You're now looking at a far wider spectrum, but analysis, having looked at masses of different variables thereafter, makes it more and more difficult to work out which variable is where our problem arises. The linkage you're talking about very much links into what the Salvesen Mindroom Research Centre is doing, which is very much studying on the research. And the linkage we have with the Salvesen Mindroom Centre, which is concentrating on the outside world and trying to put things into practice. So I think the actual choice of the subject of this lecture is absolutely what we need in today's world. And we've got to get to a conclusion of the research that you're doing to actually be really making the thing beneficial to all. So thank you very much for all the work you've been doing. We look forward to not only meeting you, but also to be talking more about this subject. And as we've determined in these lectures, we're not allowed to do any clapping, but we do wave our hands. So thank you very much and congratulations. Well done.